Welcome to the Conciliators Guild podcast. My name is John Zada. Today we're joined by author Jason Webster, who'll be talking with me about one of his latest works entitled Violencia, A New History of Spain, Past, Present, and Future of the West. That same book in North America goes by the title Why Spain Matters, the story of the land that shaped the world. For our audience who may not be familiar with Jason, he is an Anglo-American crime fiction and travel writer and the author of numerous books about Spain, where he spent a considerable portion of his adult life. Among other things, Violencia looks at the tremendous and little-known influence Spain has had on the Western world. But as we'll hear shortly, this is merely a starting point that takes us down a very fascinating rabbit hole of history. Thanks for being here, Jason. It's great to have you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Before we dive in, you're a specialist and expert on Spain. You've spent a great deal of time there. You live and breathe the place, both in real life and on the written page. Tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be so deeply connected with the country.
Yeah, Spain, I just kind of followed a whim. It was an intuition, really, that I needed to be connected to Spain. A feeling that I'd had from probably about the age of 13 or 14. I remember I saw some images of the Alhambra Palace. I think there was in a book, and these photographs just absolutely blew my mind. I couldn't believe that I was seeing something so amazingly beautiful. You know, just all that incredible mosaic work and what have you that's there in the Alhambra. So I immediately fell in love with the Alhambra, and with it, sort of Spain. But I kind of didn't go straight to Spain. I kind of went down a few sort of cul-de-sacs first. I went to sort of live in Italy for a while when I left home, and then I ended up doing Arabic and Islamic history at university, and went to live in Egypt as a result and stuff. And actually that was sort of partly to do with this sort of obsession that I'd had and developed with the Alhambra. But then when I'd finished my degree and I was suddenly free to kind of do anything I wanted, and I suddenly thought, actually, the place I've always wanted to go to is Spain. And so I that's exactly what I did. I just sort of packed a bag, jumped on an airplane and went to live in Spain. And immediately, it was like within almost minutes really of landing in Spain, there was just this connection, and there's like, right, this is absolutely the place I need to be. There's something about this country which fascinates me and enraptures me. Really, it's sort of, I have a sort of long-standing 30-year love story with Spain, and so it's like, I'm never bored of it. I never find it dull. There's always something new to discover. I've written, I can't remember, maybe 15 books now, with either set in Spain or with sort of Spanish themes. And I just find it something I can keep exploring because it is such a hugely fascinating and complex country. There's just masses there. My wife is Spanish. My two boys were born there, so I have a very, very strong personal connection to the country.
Students growing up in the West are taught about the influences of places like Greece and Rome on the Western world. One of the themes of your book is that Spain had a very great impact on the West, one that very few people know about. Tell us about that.
Well, the Western world tends to view, like you say, there's a sort of idea that the Western world is sort of built out of a marriage between the classical world and Judeo-Christian culture, and that these two sort of come together and produce the Western world. And that there's a third element in that equation which is missing, which is the Islamic element. And that Islamic element very much comes into the Western world through Spain, through Moorish Spain and sort of medieval Spain. Obviously a little bit through Sicily as well at the same time, and in the Holy Land and the Crusader period as well. But it's mostly through Spain where this Islamic influence, it goes into the forming and the forging of what we call Western civilization. So part of Spain's influence on the Western world is through that Islamic aspect, but it goes beyond that. I find, I was just looking as I was doing the research for this book, I was just coming across more and more examples of where the Spanish got there first, in ways that people just don't seem to remember. So actually at the start of the book, what I sort of talk about Spain as a Cassandra figure. Cassandra, if you all remember from the Iliad, is she's a sort of princess of Troy, and she's been gifted she has the gift of prophecy, but at the same time she's cursed because nobody will ever listen to her, nobody ever will believe her prophecy. So she, prophesies the fall of Troy, and nobody pays any notice. And in many ways, I find that Spain is a Cassandra figure because she, as a country, is sort of prophesying, or she acts as a harbinger for all kinds of things that are going to happen, and yet nobody really pays her any attention. I mean, for example, the Spanish. The discovery of the New World starts from Spain. That in itself should place Spain at the very center of ideas about Western culture and Western civilization. And somehow, this is the springboard of what is the Western world, which, obviously the 1492 and the discovery of the Americas is one of the key planks of the definition of Western civilization. And yet it's sort of brushed over. It's sort of like, oh well, yeah, but Columbus wasn't Spanish anyway, or whatever. People kind of go, yeah, but then the Spanish, they just sort of they were terrible, and they just massacred everybody, and they stole all the gold, and then they lost all their power. So people sort of want to get around it, rather than saying, well, actually, yeah, there's this huge role that Spain plays in that one simple example. But there are many other examples, even as recently as the Occupy movement. But before people were occupying Wall Street, or whatever various squares in London, there'd been a big Occupy movement in Madrid for several months, at least 6 months beforehand, and that in turn was possibly inspired by what was happening during the whole Arab Spring movement. So Spain, for me, acts as a kind of a crossroads between East and West, and North and South, and the Mediterranean world and the Atlantic world. Because all these influences come together, because it is this kind of crossroads place, all these elements kind of come together, and out of this sort of pressure cooker, this crucible that is Spain, amazing things can happen, amazing things can occur. Pure gold is sometimes created in this alchemist's crucible. At the same time, base lead is often the result as well. So there's a sort of dual thing going on. But that, for me, in a nutshell, is the fascination of Spain and some of the ideas that I'm trying to get across in the book.
There's so much in that perspective, and yet you dive even deeper in your examination of Spanish history. Another main theme that runs through your book is that Spain, its history is marked by perpetual civil conflict and polarization. You also say that Spaniards have deliberately, I would say, almost sanitized or blinded themselves to aspects of that history in order to forge new national identities, to unite their often fragmented nation. You've been writing about Spain for a while. You've been traveling there for many years. How and when did the penny drop in terms of seeing this pattern of polarization and conflict? Describe that moment when you actually realized this.
Yeah, I suppose it had been building up in the back of my mind for some time. But the moment when I thought, okay, I've got to write a book about this was, so it was back in, when was it? 2017, when the Catalans held that referendum on independence, or they tried to, and they were sort of crushed by the Spanish state, and they really sent the police in very hard. And the images, I remember those images that were on TV, and they flashed around the world, and it was really disturbing to see how police were going in with batons, trying to beating over the head people who were simply trying to vote. This is the basic fundamental building block of a democracy is voting, and the police were in this supposed democracy, is first world democracy. Police were going in, beating people over the head who were just trying to vote. But I remember I was in Barcelona like a week after that, after the failed referendum on independence. The tension in Barcelona was just absolutely palpable. It was electric. And I remember turning a corner, and there was a graffiti or graffito on the wall, and it was a picture of Franco with devil's horns coming out of the top of his head, and they'd written above it, they said, "Españoles todos, he vuelto," which means, Spaniards, I'm back. And it was like, wow, my God, yes, it was like, it was like history coming full circle. It did feel for a few minutes, it did feel as though Francoism was on the rise again. And it was this sort of it was this crushing of a independence movement, a regional independence movement. And because I know a fair amount about Spanish history, it was suddenly all the sort of cards seemed to just sort of stack up for me at that point, because it wasn't just about Franco. Franco wasn't the first person who had tried to kind of crush regional independence movements in Spain. This is a pattern that goes back over not even centuries, millennia, of this sort of tension between a centralism and a regionalism, and that this is constant. This is a constant in Spanish history, and it's not just on, in Christian Spain or Muslim. It's the same in Al-Andalus, in Moorish Spain. It was the same in Gothic Spain, Visigothic Spain. It goes on and on and on, and it's not something that's new, and the result is generally the same, sadly.
What is it about Spain and Spaniards and the country that they inhabit that lends itself to this kind of incessant, turbulent, polarized behavior? I mean, apart from them being just human, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I get your point. Okay, I think there are a few key factors. One of them is geography. So Spain is a very mountainous country. A lot of people forget that. It's the second most mountainous country in Europe after Switzerland. Mountains are notoriously good dividers, as it were. If you go back to sort of medieval chronicles or medieval, diaries and stuff, people are traveling the world by boat. It's really hard to travel by road, and particularly by road in a mountainous country. For example, I'll give you an example. Madrid, so the nearest port city to Madrid, the capital of Spain, as the crow flies, is Valencia. But there was only because I remember when it was built, there was only a proper motorway built directly from Madrid to Valencia within the past sort of 20, 30 years. It's why? Because there are huge mountain ranges and, real geographical problems in between Valencia and Madrid if you want to go in a straight line. And so it would take sort of like, late 20th century, early 21st century civil engineering techniques to bridge that gap, as it were, or to cross that divide. Now, Spain is, if you look at it geographically, it's like most of the coastline has mountains very much around it. So it's like you've got these outer castle walls, you've got this sort of thin strip of coastline followed almost immediately by these sort of high mountains almost all around the entire coast. So you've got these sort of castle walls on the outside, which makes it sort of quite insular, strangely. And then inside that castle, you've got these further castle walls, i.e. more mountain ranges that divide the country up. So you've got this huge, it's a big country, which is essentially divided amongst itself by its own geography. And then you've got some, 3 or 4 sort of significant rivers as well, which act as dividers. So that's one point, geography. And another point is the sheer variety of racial groups and ethnicities that you find in Spain over the course of its history. The list is endless, but you've got peoples arriving there over time from all over the world. So you've got Africans, North Africans, you've got Romans, you've got Celts, you've got Iberians, the so-called native Iberians, but they probably came from North Africa originally. You've got the Visigoths arriving, and you've got sort of various tribes like the Alans and the Sueves. Who the hell remembers the Sueves? And the Vandals. The Vandals were there for about 50 years. It goes on, and also Semitic peoples as well. And what's really interesting is that people tend to think that the first sort of Semitic peoples are arriving, when the Moors invade, or the Arab Islamic invasion of 711. Well, actually, Semitic peoples have been in Spain for quite a long time before that. So the first Jewish populations to arrive in Spain could well have been from, like 500 BC or more. So well before the great diaspora of the Jews. And also Phoenicians, who were Semites, they had been arriving from sort of 1000 BC. So, and actually found the first cities in Western Europe on the Spanish coast. So Cadiz, Malaga, these are the first. They are 3,000 years old, these cities, and they're the first cities in Western Europe. Again, and there's another example where Spain is sort of at the at the cutting edge in all kinds of ways in terms of Western civilization. And then you've got the Basques. The Basques up in the north. No one even knows where the Basques come from. They speak a language that's not even Indo-European. You've got 5 official languages in Spain. It's only 40 million people. They've got 5 official languages. One of them, Basque, is not even Indo-European. What does that tell you?
And that's really what one of the things that struck me about the book was just the extent to which the country is this historical mosaic of influences. I mean, I couldn't believe the amount of connections to peoples and cultures and places and migrations and everything. And yet, the Spaniards, as you say, have tended to, forget some of these parts of its past. You mentioned that one of the periods least acknowledged or properly remembered by Spaniards, and which ironically I think tends to be well cited by outsiders, is the high period of Al-Andalus and that of the Moors. Given how important that epoch was in terms of its stellar achievements and its influence on the rest of the world, how is it that Spaniards, of all people, lost their appreciation for it? I mean, you'd think that it would be a point of great national pride, similar to other countries, being proud of a very kind of important aspect of their history.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And to answer that, you've got to sort of cast your mind back, if possible, to the Middle Ages, and you've got to see a sort of a state of almost permanent warfare in Spain between Muslims and Christians. And sometimes it's a pretty fluid situation, and sometimes Muslims are allying with Christians to fight another Muslim, or Christians are allying with Muslims to fight another Christian. It's a real jigsaw puzzle. But essentially, over time, it sort of that divide, this sort of checkered divide in Spain, sort of solidifies around a sort of a Christians on one side and Muslims on the other. Now, what are the Christians? Who are they fighting for? They're very divided amongst themselves, and they are essentially northern Spaniards pushing against southern Spaniards. And it's like, how do we kind of create this identity that unites us? And they can't. I mean, it's really, really hard, because they're fighting amongst themselves. When they're not fighting Muslims, they're fighting amongst themselves. Sometimes they're fighting amongst themselves even when they are fighting against the Muslims as well. It's a real mess. They're speaking different languages. They can barely, talk to each other. And so they have to create this sort of something that will help them stick together, a national sort of narrative or whatever it is. And they eventually come up with, oh, well, we're not Muslim. That's what unites us. We're not Muslims. Okay. And so that then turns into the symbol of what becomes Spain's patron saint, which is Santiago Matamoros, or St. James the Moor Slayer. So the actual, even today, the patron saint of Spain is this this figure of this guy on a horse, a bit like sort of St. George or something. And he's got in fact, his shield is very much like St. George, I think. And anyway, it's sort of similar. He's like on his horse, and he's smiting the heads off these beturbaned chaps on the ground. And it's sort of like, it's this very powerful visual statement. It's like, okay, that's who we are. We're the guys who kill Muslims. We're the guys who aren't Muslim, basically. We are not Muslim, right? So that's what being, quote unquote, Spanish is, and that this is what Spanishness is, in this sort of weird definition, defining yourself around a negative, which is never going to work, and it doesn't work. And so effectively what you have to do is you have to sort of ignore or expel all what you were saying, all those great achievements of the high period of Al-Andalus and Moorish Spain. You have to sort of say, well, that's not us. We didn't do that. They're not These people were not Spaniards. They were invaders, and we kicked them out. And yes, maybe they made a few nice, pretty buildings, and whatever. But there's nothing to do with those, which is clearly absurd, because there was a Muslim presence in Spain for almost 1,000 years. I mean, it goes, if you look at the very last Muslims in Spain, the Moriscos, they weren't expelled until the early 1600s. So, there were Muslims in Spain for 900 years. And, to sort of say, oh, they had nothing to do with us, and it's, there was this sort of, we were kind of like hermetically sealed from these people, is clearly crazy. It's an absolutely crazy idea. And I often sort of say this to my, Spanish friends. I said, why do you not celebrate people like Averroes, the great Cordoban philosopher of the 12th century, who is, he's acclaimed as the father of Western rational thought, not Eastern, Western rational thought. Mm-hmm. He was one of the greatest philosophers ever in the history of philosophy, and he was a Cordoban. And they go, who are you talking about? If they've even heard of Averroes, they'll go, yeah. Or I'll talk to them about Zahrawi, a fellow Cordoban of Averroes in the 12th century, who was the father of modern surgery. He literally wrote the book on modern surgery, and invented like 200 surgical instruments, which we still use today, including, scalpel and all kinds of things. They've never even heard of Zahrawi. Very, very few Spaniards have heard of Zahrawi. So, yeah, it's an ongoing thing, but this is sort of like, because we identify ourselves as not being Muslim, that whole side of their own history is simply swept away as though it didn't exist.
And, sticking with this topic of Spanish achievement, do you see or do you think that this, perpetual struggle that has, embroiled Spain over the ages, do you see it as being a necessary component in Spain's achievements or in its moments of excellence? I mean, there's this notion that, sometimes a degree of struggle or tension is necessary for progress or learning to happen, whether in individuals or in collectives. But so do you think this kind of this incessant conflict, this push and pull, this tension, as difficult and painful as it was over the ages, also contributed something to the country's excellence in terms of its achievements?
Gosh, yes. What a question. I mean, there's a Spanish proverb, para aprender, perder. You need to, in order to learn, you have to lose. Is there something in what you're saying? Maybe. I'm not sure if I'd like to speculate. It's almost too tragic, isn't it, to have to sort of say, yes, you need conflict in order for there to be great cultural achievements or what have you. Is that part of the sort of, is that an essential element of the sort of the pressure within the sort of crucible of Spain? Is it one of the necessary elements for producing the gold? I wish it weren't, and I hope it doesn't have to be. It's what I notice in Spain is that it is a constant, though. Every single century in Spanish history has seen at least one major civil war or civil conflict. I mean, every single one. And civil wars are not, every country has had civil wars, but not, perhaps not quite as such a constant refrain through their history. And it's a sad truth, and in some ways, I hope I'm wrong. Nobody would be happier if I were wrong in sort of saying that every century has to have a civil conflict. I hope the 21st century that we're in will buck this trend. But I suppose sometimes when I was writing this book, I was sort of imagining that, imagine Spain was sort of a patient lying on the couch, and somehow I'm some sort of psychiatrist, and you sort of and Spain is sort of telling me its own story, and you're kind of going, well, there are a few repeated patterns here in your life story. And as anybody with psychology 101 will tell you, anybody who's sort of got a repeated pattern of behavior in their life, the tendency is that they're going to continue it. It requires a major shift, I think, to break out of that pattern. And my hope is obviously that Spain can break out of this pattern, and I hope that I'm wrong, and that the 21st century will be an entirely peaceful and conflict-free century for Spain. But if that does happen, it will be the very first century in Spanish history to be so.
You mentioned repeatedly that the Spanish experience tends to foretell or predict developments in the rest of Europe and the West. Can you give a few examples of that?
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned sort of already modern surgery, Western rational thought, but things like the Crusades themselves. Actually, the very first Crusade was about sort of 30 years before the main Crusades in a town called Barbastro, in northern Spain, where this sort of this sort of union of Christian knights who were promised time off purgatory if they went and fought the infidel. If they went, with papal sort of dispensation, they went off and they conquered the city of Barbastro. So, actually the very first crusade really takes place in Spain. Chivalry and the ideas of romantic love come out of Spain, reach Western Europe out of Spain. I mean, there is no real concept of romantic love. Or the idea of holding women up as on pedestals, and that concept is completely absent in Western civilization until it starts arriving, until we start seeing it in the sort of courtly love movement in southern France. Interestingly, very very close to Moorish Spain, and actually you can sort of pinpoint, the arrival, you can pinpoint how that arrives in Western Europe with the writing of a book called The Ring of the Dove by Ibn Hazm in the 1020s, I think it is, in a town near Valencia called Xàtiva. He's there in Ibn Hazm is in exile in this town in Xàtiva. I've been to Xàtiva many times. There's not even a plaque on a wall or a street named after him or anything, and yet this enormously important book in Western literature was written in this town, and he was the first person to write about sort of selfless love, or self-sacrificing love, and this then feeds into, and there's a lot of academic debate about this, but I would argue that it does, that this goes into sort of Christian Europe and sort of feeds that movement of courtly love. I just sort of keep going, and even in the 20th century, and nobody sort of has noticed this before, but it's only so let's George Orwell, possibly one of the possibly the greatest, certainly one of the greatest writers in the 20th century, and somebody who is acting as a sort of a Cassandra figure in some ways, or as a prophet in some ways, with 1984. He's trying to sort of describe a world that could come into being. Now, Orwell's ideas for Animal Farm and 1984 come directly out of his experiences fighting in the Spanish Civil War. So it's by going to Spain, experiencing all of that, and seeing what's happening in Spain, and seeing this authoritarian left movement really taking off under Stalin's influence. He then absorbs all of that and novelizes it into Animal Farm in 1984, and tells the world about, hey guys, you need to be aware of this. This is what's going on. This is this is where the world is going to go if we're not careful. That's coming directly out of Spanish. The Spanish Civil War itself is a harbinger of World War II and also the Cold War. So many examples.
I mean, that's where I was going to go to next. To what extent do you see that contemporary, more modern ideological conflict perhaps now playing out in the rest of the West in terms of the polarization happening now? Is there a connection for you in terms of that predictive or foretelling aspect of Spanish experience?
I think it's interesting, particularly to watch how Spain has dealt with the whole Catalan independence movement. So we're dealing with all kinds of paradoxes and contradictions at the moment in the world, contradictions within our democratic system. What happens when a fascist is democratically elected the president of the US, for example? What do you do? What's that's democracy at work, and yet at the same time it's produced a sort of a very dubiously democratic result. What do you do? And COVID, what do you do now with COVID? How do you maintain a sort of a tolerant, democratic, liberal state, and yet at the same time countries like Austria and maybe Germany, they're talking about forcing people to have their vaccines? How do you square, okay, these are really, really complex problems. Spain has been dealing with one of these for several years now, with the whole Catalan question. How can you be a liberal democratic state which surely understands the concept of self-determination. I mean, that's one of the fundamental precepts of the United Nations, self-determination. And yet, at the same time, when the Catalans tried to make a decision on their own independence, what do? Well, you went in there and just started beating people up. The point I'm making that in my book is that the Spanish state's reaction back in 2017 to that was simply doing what it has always done, and it doesn't know how to do anything different. This is exactly what it always does. It just goes it uses violence in order to sort of hold the country together, because nothing else has worked. That's the only thing that has worked over time. But I think broadening out, to answer your question, broadening it out to what are the warning signs potentially in Spain, or what have they been over the past few years for the rest of the world? Well, it's, how do we square these contradictions that are at the heart of a democratic system, and where one vision of that democratic system is in direct conflict with another vision of that democratic system, and where's it going? The Spanish answer has been violence, state-sponsored violence. Is that the way it's going to go, in the rest of the world? I don't know. I mean, I don't honestly know how the Austrians and the Germans are going to force people who don't want to have vaccines to have those vaccines. What do you do with them? Do you hold them down, put them in a straitjacket, and stick a needle in their arm? I mean, you know what I mean? That's a sort of an extreme version, but state violence in order to impose or to maintain the status quo, where these are really complex problems that we're dealing with.
But yet Spain is also known for its periods of tolerance. So are there positive lessons in how Spain has dealt with its differences that perhaps the West could learn from?
Absolutely. No, they have. And, why was Al-Andalus such an amazing place? Not for the whole history. We mustn't fall into the trap of thinking that the whole of Moorish Spain was the sort of golden age. There are golden moments in it. And why? Well, because actually for a while there was relative for the Middle Ages tolerance towards other groups, towards Christians and towards Jews. And so these three communities are coexisting to some degree, and that marriage of cultures helps to produce this magnificent civilization that is Moorish Spain. And then even more recently, in the 1980s and 1990s, I mean, I was lucky enough to catch the sort of tail end of this. Spain was the sexiest country in Europe for about 20 years. It was fantastic, because after Franco died in 1975, by about the early 1980s, people are moving away politically and psychologically and emotionally from those dictatorship years. And it becomes, Spain is fantastic. It's exciting. It's a country of artists. This is, Almodovar's making those amazing films. And I managed to catch the sort of tail end of that movement in Spain, that cultural blossoming in Spain, sort of in the early 90s. And, it was a really exciting time. It was just a brilliant, brilliant place to be. There was a real sense of energy. And it was because, they'd done away with this sort of authoritarian past, and it was okay, we accept each other, and we are just going to celebrate each other and celebrate our differences, and there's a sort of release of energy. And so I think if you can harness that, if you harness all the differences in Spain, and you try and sort of somehow creatively sort of bring them together so that they're harmonizing, then amazing things happen. It's much easier said than done, but I think that has to be the goal, and that has to be where you're pushing towards. But at the same time, you have to be acknowledging all these different aspects. You've got to be staring down everything that's there. You can't just be sweeping stuff under the carpet, and that is what happened in the 80s and 90s, and even to some degree today. It's like, okay, we're just going to pretend the whole Franco period and the Spanish Civil War didn't exist. No, you got to actually really look hard at it and learn the lessons from it and move forward at the same time. I think that the mistake has been over the past 20 or 30 years in Spain has been to sort of say, well, look, we're just not going to go there. We're going to, and this happens at several moments in Spanish history where people say, right, we're just going to forget that. We'll forget that ever existed. And we're going to sort of just plow on from here on. But what happens in those situations is like the ghosts from the past never leave you, and eventually they come back and they cause problems further down the line.
Finally, I can't help but ask, do you have any predictions on where Spain is headed looking forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, difficult question right now, difficult question, because I feel the whole world is in a has been in a state for the past sort of 5 or 6 years where it's pretty difficult to predict anything. Um, to use that phrase of the black swan, Nicholas Nassim Taleb's idea of the black swan. I mean, I feel ever since, gosh, when is it? Was it 2014 when, first of all, there was the Brexit referendum in Britain, and, Trump coming into power in the US, and now COVID, we just seem to have been, it's like black swan events just seem to be coming out of nowhere. And black swan events always come out of nowhere. That's the whole point of a black swan event. But you see what I mean? It's sort of left field stuff. It seems to be dominating our lives right now. So it's actually quite hard to make any predictions at all. My hope is to say that I'm wrong, and that the 21st century will be the first totally peaceful and civil war free century in Spanish history. I hope I'm really wrong on that. And at the same time, if I do want to make a prediction, it will be that Spain will continue to sort of presage what's going to happen in the rest of the Western world. It will continue to be ignored. It's, as a Cassandra figure, its prescience will continue to be ignored, and that amazing cultural phenomena will come out of Spain, because they always do. And the Spanish have this sort of genius for surprising us culturally in all kinds of ways. And it may be just an individual like Picasso in the 20th century, or Goya in the 19th century, or it may be a whole movement, who knows. But something will come out of Spain which will absolutely knock our socks off. I predict that. Yeah.
Fascinating. And I think that's a good place to wrap things up. Thanks for speaking with me today, Jason.
Not at all. I loved every minute of it. Thank you so much.
That was writer Jason Webster. He's the author of Violencia, A New History of Spain, Past, Present, and Future of the West. In North America, you can find that same book under the title Why Spain Matters, the story of the land that shaped the world. The book is available from major online retailers or by special order from your local bookstore. You can find out more about Jason by visiting his website, jasonwebster, that's one word, .net. And thanks for listening.